The cut on my hand was not healing. That sounds like nothing. Men get cuts, men heal. But I had been healing since before men knew how to name the thing that hurt them, and this small line across the meat of my left palm opened on a hunting trip, a branch I grabbed without thinking. A careless moment of the kind I had long since trained myself not to have was still pink and visible 4 days later. I pressed the pad of my thumb against it each morning before Carolyn woke up. Each morning it was still there. Diminished, yes. But there. In 14,000 years, I had learned to read the world the way a sailor reads water. Small signs. The way a current bends before a storm. The way a horse's ear twitches a half-second before it bolts. I had watched cities rise from mud walls and collapse back into them. I had watched men with absolute certainty about the nature of the universe burn each other alive over which direction to face while praying. I had learned, above all things, to notice, and I was noticing now. My name in this decade was John Young. Before that, it had been a name I used in a city 3 hours north of where I now sat, a comparative religion professor at a small university in the Sacramento Valley, a man who graded papers and attended faculty meetings, and occasionally surprised his colleagues with the specificity of his historical knowledge. Before that, many other names, many other decades. I had been a farmer in soil that is now desert. A soldier in armies whose flags are held by museums. A physician in a century when physicians were as likely to kill you as cure you, which made the profession feel familiar. I had been a wandering teacher in a region of the ancient world where wandering teachers were not unusual, and I had said things I considered obvious. Kindness costs nothing. The divine is not a transaction. What matters is how you treat the person in front of you, and those things had been mistaken, over the centuries, for something more. That particular misunderstanding had followed me across 2,000 years of human history, in ways I still found difficult to look at directly. Now I was here, a mid-sized California university. A faculty office with books on 3 walls, a window overlooking the quad, a parking permit for Lot C, a relationship with a woman who was smart enough to notice things and kind enough not to always say so. I taught survey courses on the major world faiths, their origins, their texts, their political lives, the ways belief mutates when it travels across time and geography. It was, of all the things I had been, perhaps the most honest work I had ever done. I understood religion the way a man understands weather if he has lived outdoors long enough, not mystically, not devotionally, practically, patiently, from the inside and the outside, and from a distance so great that the distinction between inside and outside had long since stopped being the most interesting question. The students were young in the way that all students at all times have been young, certain about the wrong things, uncertain about the things that will matter, carrying within them the capacity for both great cruelty and great tenderness, the ratio not yet settled. I liked them, as a group and as individuals, more than most of my colleagues seemed to. The colleagues who had grown cynical about undergraduate education, and there were many, in every department, in every institution I had been part of had, I thought, lost track of what they were looking at. They were looking at the early version of a thing that would develop over the course of a full human life, and judging it by the standards of the finished version. That seemed to me a fundamental error of perspective. You do not evaluate a river by its source. I had good semesters and ordinary semesters. I had office hours that were crowded and office hours where no one came. I gave lectures that I could feel landing, the particular quiet of a room where people are genuinely following a thought to its conclusion, and lectures that dispersed into the middle distance without doing any particular work. I attended the faculty meetings that were mandatory and avoided the ones that were merely customary, a ratio I had arrived at across several decades of university employment, and which I held to with a consistency my department chair had once described, with dry accuracy, as admirably selective. This was the life I had assembled. It was real. All the lives I had assembled had been real, in the sense that I had inhabited them fully, without quotation marks, without the private reservations of a man who knows he will be somewhere else in 10 years. You cannot live with quotation marks around everything. You become something hollow, something that moves through the world without being moved by it. I had learned that early, in which century I could not tell you exactly, but early, and I had made it a practice to be genuinely present in each decade, to let the life of it actually happen to me, not to observe it from a sufficient distance to protect myself from its weight. The weight was the point. The weight was what made it real. Carolyn knew I was older than I looked. She knew I had been other people before John Young, had lived other lives in other places under other names. She knew the bones of it. She did not know the full distance. There are things you cannot say to a person you love without the love becoming a different object, smaller, stranger, something held in gloves rather than in bare hands. The love had to be built around the silence the way architecture is built around a column. The column holds the weight. The beauty is in what surrounds it. This was not cruelty. It was the only way I had found, across more attempts than I could easily number, to keep anything. The book had been on my shelf for 3 years. Art Jenkins had written it. Art had been one of the friends present the night I made the mistake of telling the truth, the whole truth, the length of it, the depth of it, told it in a room full of intelligent people I had trusted with my history, because I was leaving the next morning and thought I would never see any of them again. Art had written it all down afterward, had sourced it, structured it, published it with an academic press that had apparently not understood what it was agreeing to print. The academic community treated his manuscript the way it treats anything that cannot be falsified or dismissed cleanly, with contempt carried at a safe distance. His university had not renewed his contract. The book had found a small, devoted, eccentric readership, the kind of readership that maintains websites and annotates paperbacks and shows up at readings when the venue is a library in a strip mall. I owned a copy because Art had signed it and mailed it to the address of my previous name with no return address, as if he understood the necessity of distance even in an act of reaching out. I did not display the book. It lived spine-in on a high shelf between 2 volumes on Zoroastrian cosmology, which was where I put things I needed not to see every day. That was a miscalculation. I am, for all my years, still capable of miscalculation. The certainty of survival can breed a subtle carelessness, the way long health breeds the illusion of permanence. Isabel Chang was the kind of student who borrowed books. She was 22, precise, curious in the way that sometimes tips into prosecutorial. She asked questions in class that were not quite questions. They were observations shaped like questions, testing whether I would flinch or elaborate or retreat into the comfortable generalities that professors use when they want to seem engaged while actually performing distance. Most professors find that quality in a student irritating. I found it familiar. I had been that student in a dozen different centuries, in rooms lit by oil and tallow, and then by gas, and then by the fluorescent hum that had taken me years to stop noticing. She asked to borrow something on early Buddhist transmission to the West. I waved her toward the shelf. I was grading at my desk, midterms, comparative theology, 50 pages of undergraduate effort at understanding things most undergraduates have spent 19 or 20 years not needing to understand. I heard her moving along the spines, the small sounds of browsing, the occasional careful extraction and replacement of a volume. I was not paying attention the way I should always be paying attention. There was a gap in my vigilance. There are gaps in every vigilance, even the old ones. And then she was gone and the room was quiet. I looked up 10 minutes later and saw the space on the shelf. The Zoroastrian volumes had shifted. The space between them was wrong by exactly the width of one book. I stood, looked. The Jenkins book was not there. I had a moment, very old, very familiar, the feeling of standing at the edge of something you have already fallen off before, somewhere else, in another form, and recognizing the drop before your feet go over. Then I sat back down and looked at the cut on my palm. It had not healed. The book was gone. These two facts sat beside each other with the quiet patience of things that intend to ruin you. I did not chase her. I did not make a scene. I had not survived 14 millennia by making scenes. I finished grading. I drove home on streets that smelled of Sacramento Valley evening, dry grass and exhaust, and the particular warmth of asphalt releasing a day's worth of sun. I told Carolyn the food smelled wonderful because it did, because she was a person who paid attention when she cooked, and I had always found that moving, the human habit of making things well even when well is not required, even when no one would notice if you didn't, especially then. I ate. I stayed at the table longer than I needed to. I slept. I woke at 3 in the morning and lay still in the dark, and thought about what was written inside the cover of that book. Art had written, "For John Oldman, wherever he has gone to next, I think I believe you. Art." That inscription was the only dangerous thing in the book. The text itself was academic, dense, self-hedging in the way academics hedge when they suspect they will be mocked. But the inscription was private and specific and contained two things that I had not used together in a decade: the name Oldman, and the implication that John Oldman was a person who went places, went and kept going, a person who was somewhere right now, under a different name, 10 years further along. Isabel would read the inscription. Isabel noticed things. Isabel was precisely the kind of person who, having noticed a thing, does something about it. I had been through variations of this before, though not often. Most people who encounter a strange fact about someone they know choose, quietly and without ever acknowledging the choice, not to pursue it. The cost of pursuing a strange fact about a person you know is that you learn something. Most people do not want strange. They want the world to be approximately the size it has always been. The strangeness of existence, the absolute dailiness of the extraordinary, is something most people prefer to metabolize in small doses, in comfortable frames, in the form of books and films, where the strangeness is safely contained between a cover or a runtime and can be put away when it becomes too much. Isabel did not want a comfortable frame. She wanted a larger world. Her friends were three. Lico, who was quiet and technically skilled, comfortable with information the way his generation is comfortable with it, not in the sense of understanding it deeply, but in the sense of being able to find it and move it and cross-reference it with a facility that would have seemed uncanny to earlier centuries, and was, to him, simply Tuesday. Tara, who was warm and genuinely kind, and who would later, when she told me her account of those weeks, describe the early days of the investigation with something approaching shame, not because she hadn't participated, but because she had wanted to and hadn't been strong enough in her wanting to stop it. And Philip. Philip sat in my comparative religion class with the precise stillness of someone who has organized his inner life around a single load-bearing column and knows, without examining it, that everything else hangs from that one point. He took careful notes. He asked respectful questions. He was polite to other students in the particular way of someone who has been taught that politeness is a form of godliness and takes the instruction seriously. His faith was not performative. That is important. It was the real thing, the thing that costs something. That is not just habit or identity or social inheritance, but a genuine daily choice to orient yourself toward a set of beliefs about the world and act accordingly. I respected it. I had watched that quality in believers across every tradition I had encountered, and I knew the texture of it, and Philip had it. What he also had, which I could not have named until later, was a faith that had been built without adequate foundations for doubt. Not because he was stupid, he wasn't, but because no one had ever offered him the doubt at the right time, in the right form, with the right care. The faith had been constructed in a period of personal difficulty, had become load-bearing very quickly, and had never been tested in a way that didn't simply confirm it. A structure built that way holds fine until the load changes. Then it fails all at once. Art Jenkins, I learned later, was no longer the recluse I had imagined. He had spent the decade since publication quietly building, not publicly, not with any agenda I would characterize as hostile, but with the patient purposefulness of a man who has been told he is wrong about the most important thing he has ever claimed to know and who cannot let it go. He had a network, careful correspondence, people who had noticed anomalies in records, enrollment histories, physical descriptions in old letters, the general shape of a man who moved steadily south through California in decade-long increments, never in the same position longer than it took for people to begin to find his youthfulness unusual. I thought about Art sometimes in those 10 days. I thought about what it costs to believe something true and be unable to prove it, to carry the knowledge of a real thing through a world that has decided the real thing isn't real. That is a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, which has its own rhythms and can be managed, but the loneliness of knowing something that cannot be shared without consequences so large they eliminate most of the candidates for sharing. Art had tried to share it. The consequences had been large. And yet he had continued, quietly, in the patient way of a man who has decided that being right matters more than being believed, and that he will keep working until the believing catches up. I respected him for it, even as I recognized that his persistence was the engine of my current difficulty. He had not meant to expose me, or perhaps he had, in some layered way that he had not fully examined, in the way people sometimes do things for two reasons simultaneously, one they can name and one they prefer not to. I did not hold it against him either way. I had been holding things against people for 14,000 years, and I had found it produced nothing useful. The holding was heavier than the thing held. Lico was good at networks. He was good at finding the connective tissue between data points that seemed unrelated until you looked at them the right way. He found Art within 48 hours of Isabel showing him the inscription. Art responded, as I said, within the hour. What Art gave them was not a photograph. He didn't have one clear enough, but something in some ways more useful, a methodology. He showed them how he had tracked the previous iteration of me, the patterns, the decade cycle, the southward drift through the California academic world. He gave them the bones of it, and Lico put the rest of the flesh on with the tools of his generation, with the databases and the cross-references and the reverse image searches, and the patient threading of fragments into a shape. The shape they arrived at was a man who had been at Chico for 9 years, who had no record before the position at Chico that satisfied normal background check standards, a gap that had been papered over with the kind of quiet institutional acceptance that happens when a hire is sufficiently credentialed and impressive that the HR department does not look too hard at the seams, who had been photographed exactly once in the local press, at a faculty symposium, and who was, in that photograph, standing at a precise angle that minimized the readability of his face. Not aggressively so, just slightly. The angle of a man who has, across a very long time, developed an instinct for being in pictures without being captured by them. It was not enough for a legal case, or a scientific paper, or any formal instrument of demonstration. But it was enough for 4 22-year-olds in a university town who had decided the thing was true and were now only collecting confirmations. I had made a miscalculation, letting the book stay on the shelf. I had made a second one in those 10 days by not leaving. I want to be precise about the nature of that second miscalculation because I think it matters. It was not cowardice. I have been frightened before and I know the specific texture of the choices fear makes, and this was not that. It was something more like exhaustion with a particular kind of motion. The motion of constant departure. The motion of always being the person who leaves before the consequences of being known arrive, who is always one step ahead of the moment when someone who cares about you realizes they don't know you as well as they thought. I was tired of being one step ahead. That is the simplest way to put it. After 14,000 years of it, I was tired of it in a way that I could not quite locate the bottom of, and the tiredness and the cut on my hand and the slight change in how the days felt were sitting beside each other in a way that suggested, without quite asserting, that something was different this time. That the normal move, pack, drive, become someone else, was perhaps not the only move, perhaps not even the best one. The 10 days that followed were, from the outside, very quiet. I kept teaching. I graded papers. I had coffee with Carolyn on the back porch in the mornings and watched the oak tree at the edge of our yard go through the early autumn undressing, leaf by leaf, in the dry California way that is nothing like the spectacular New England version, but is, I have always thought, more honest, quieter, less theatrical, a small divestiture rather than a performance. Carolyn looked at my hand. "Still there," she said, meaning the cut. "It's getting better." She looked at me with the expression I had come to know over 3 years, the one that said she had a question she was not going to ask yet, but was keeping it somewhere close to the surface. She had a great deal of patience, Carolyn. It came from a combination of her nature and her professional life. She was a biologist, and biologists develop a tolerance for the pace of things, a willingness to wait for processes to complete rather than forcing conclusion. She had applied that tolerance to me in ways I did not always deserve. "Are you worried about something?" she asked. "No," I said. I was not lying exactly. Worry implies a future you expect to survive in a form continuous with the present, and I was not certain, for the first time in a very long time, what form the future was going to take. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she poured more coffee and we watched the oak tree. I want to describe the 10 days before the confrontation with the precision they deserve, because precision is the only honesty I have left, and because those 10 days had a texture I do not want to lose by summarizing them. They did not feel like crisis from the inside. Crisis has a speed to it, a physiological acceleration, a tunnel narrowing of perception. What those days felt like was slower, more like standing on a wide flat plain and watching weather approach from a very great distance. You can see it coming. You can see the scale of it. You have time, perhaps, to move. But the plain is flat and large, and the decision about which direction to go keeps not quite crystallizing, and so you stand and watch the weather come, and the watching itself becomes a kind of stance. Every morning I drove to the university and taught. The survey lectures that semester were on the spread of monotheism through the Mediterranean world, which required a quality of nuance that I was temperamentally suited for. It is easy to be nuanced about things you remember, less easy to be passionate in the simple directional ways that certain students prefer. I had known the world those texts were trying to describe. I had walked through it. The gap between the texts and the world they described was something I could see without effort, the way you can see the gap between a photograph and the room it was taken in when you know the room. None of my students knew this, of course. They knew me as the professor who gave unexpectedly precise historical details and who had a way of pausing before answering questions that suggested he was deciding how much to say rather than what to say. Several of them had commented on this pause in their course evaluations. It was cited variously as depth, evasiveness, and a kind of weird, careful thing he does. All 3 were accurate. In the evenings I went home to Carolyn. I cooked 2 nights of those 10, which I almost never did, because cooking is something I have always done to occupy the hands when the mind needs to move through something, and the hands need not to be idle. I made things I had made in other centuries, adapted for available ingredients. A thick grain porridge I had first eaten in a part of the world that would not be named for another 8,000 years, and a slow-braised meat dish that I had learned from a woman in a part of the Mediterranean that was now, in its current political form, unrecognizable from what it had been when she had shown me the technique. Carolyn ate both and said they were very good and did not ask me what I was thinking, which was, in those 10 days, the greatest gift she gave me. Philip found the photograph on day 7, a faculty directory page, decade-old, a compressed image of a man standing in a group of colleagues outside a departmental building in a Northern California university town. The image was blurred in the way digital photographs from that era are blurred when they've been compressed and captured again, flattened, color degraded, a little spectral. But it was clear enough. The proportions of the face, the set of the jaw, the way the man in the photograph stood slightly apart from the others, not antisocially, but with the particular quality of a person who is comfortable being precisely where he is, and does not need to lean toward the group to feel included. Philip brought the photograph to Isabel first, then to Tara. Tara looked at it for a long time. She said, according to her own later account, "We should leave him alone." She said it seriously, and she said it looking at the photograph rather than at Philip, which I think was her way of explaining exactly what she meant without having to say it directly. If this is true, and I believe it is, then she had understood something the others hadn't yet reached. She understood that finding this particular truth was not going to make anything better for anyone. Not for John Young, and not, especially, not for Philip, who by day 7 had stopped approaching the investigation with the equanimity of a puzzle solver, and had started approaching it with the trembling intensity of a man reaching toward something he is terrified to touch. Philip heard her, he did not listen. The confrontation, when it came, was not dramatic in the way confrontations are dramatic in stories. Isabel waited outside my office on a Tuesday afternoon. Alone. She had the Jenkins book. She held it the careful way people hold evidence, two-handed, slightly out from the body, as if it were a thing with its own weight and her job was only to carry it to where it needed to go. I looked at her, she looked at me. "Come in," I said. She put the book on my desk, opened it to the inscription, said nothing. We sat with it. "What do you want to do with this?" I asked. "I want to know if it's true." "Why?" She thought about that. I gave her room to think. Outside, students crossed the quad in the flat afternoon light, backpacks slung, phones out, the ordinary bright dailiness of a world that doesn't know how strange it is. "Because if it's true," she said slowly, "then everything we think we know about the possible, about the limits of what a person is, needs to be reconsidered. And I'd rather know that than not. Even if knowing it doesn't give you anything useful. Knowledge doesn't have to be useful to matter." I looked at her for a long moment. She had the confident stillness of someone who has thought about this and not flinched from where the thinking went. I had met very few people like that. Each century produces fewer than you might hope. "Be careful what you're sure about," I said. "That's not an answer." "No, it isn't." She left with the book. She hadn't come for an answer. She had come to look at me in the way she had been looking at me since she found the inscription, and to have me look back, and to update whatever she was building inside from the encounter. What she built, I couldn't know. But I saw in her face something I recognized, the satisfaction of a person who has verified a conjecture they were afraid to verify, the quiet, terrible relief of being right. 3 days after that, Philip came alone. He came in the early evening when the building was mostly empty. He closed the office door behind him. He stood the way he always stood, controlled, careful, with that precision that was the outward form of his inward architecture. But something in the control was different. It was effortful in a way it hadn't been before. The way a door looks the same from the outside, whether or not it is actually latching. He put the book on my desk. He did not need to open it. He had read it. He had read it, I learned later from Tara, 7 times in the 10 days since Isabel found it, underlining, annotating, working through it with the same methodical attention he gave to scripture. He had put the two things, the book and his faith, side by side in his mind and been trying, with increasing desperation, to find a reading that let them coexist. "I need to know," he said. "Philip, please." He said it without theatrics. Just the word, just the need behind it, naked in the quiet office. I looked at him for a long time. He was 23 years old. He had a life ahead of him that was going to be difficult in any version of it, with or without what I was about to say. The question was what foundation it would be built on. "Come with me," I said. I drove him out to a stretch of national forest east of town. A dirt pullout off a service road, A place I went sometimes in the evenings when I needed to be in a place where the human construction of things was not the dominant fact. The trees were old second growth, tall and sparse in the way of California dry forest. The air was cold and mineral and smelled of pine resin and the particular dryness of October at elevation. We sat on the hood of my car and I told him things, not everything, but enough to be honest. I told him I had been born, if born is the right word, and it is approximately right, at the opening of what geologists call the Holocene epoch, when the last ice retreated and the world turned warm and wet, and the population of animals that were becoming human began, with no particular announcement, to do the thing that separated them from every other form of life that had ever existed. They began to wonder why. Not what, not how, those were the animal responses, the practical problem-solving common to anything that had to find food and avoid death. But why? Why the sun? Why the night? Why the dead do not come back? That wondering, I told him, was the most extraordinary thing I had ever encountered in 14,000 years of being alive. Not any individual product of the wondering, not any single civilization or technology or work of art. The wondering itself, the species that could not stop asking the question even when the asking made things harder. I had walked beside that wondering for the entire length of the Holocene. I had known men and women in the grip of it in every century, in every corner of the world I had managed to reach. And I had contributed once to a particular form of it, had said things in a particular time and place that had gotten attached to something larger than I intended, had been shaped and transmitted and institutionalized in ways I had not foreseen, and could not have controlled, and spent 2,000 years trying not to think about too carefully. Philip was very still. "What you're saying," he said slowly, "you're saying you were." I was a teacher, a man who walked from town to town and said things that seemed important to me, things I had learned across a very long life. And the things you said were taken as more than I meant them. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. I could hear the pines moving slightly in the upper canopy, the way tall trees sway at the top while the base stays still, the movement invisible unless you look up. Then it was all, he stopped. The kindness was real, the practice of it was real, the effect of it on the people who practiced it real. Whether or not I am, what the tradition eventually decided I was doesn't change what was actually said, or what it was worth. You don't understand, he said. His voice had gone somewhere farther away. You don't understand what it would mean, what I would lose. Tell me. He shook his head. He wasn't being reticent. He was discovering, I think, that the thing he would lose was not something he had ever put into language before. It was too structural for language. It was the thing the language depended on. I have had losses, I said, many of them, over a long time. I know that knowing something true can feel like a loss. I know the difference between real loss and the loss of an illusion is sometimes very hard to see from the inside. Is that supposed to help? No. I don't think anything I say right now is going to help. I'm just trying to be accurate. He turned and looked at me. In the moonlight, the moon was up by then, 3/4, cold and bright. His face looked younger than his 23 years, and also, somehow, older. Like something in him had already moved to a different place than his face had caught up to yet. If all paths lead to the same thing, he said. If there's no, if one isn't true and the other's false. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I don't know. I've walked beside human wondering for 14,000 years, and the one thing I am most certain of is that certainty is the wrong tool for the questions it most wants to answer. Then what's the point? He said it quietly, not dramatically, with genuine bewilderment. The wondering, I said, the asking, the kindness you practice while you're asking, the people you are with while you're asking. He sat with that. The moon moved slightly in its arc. My hand was cold against the hood of the car. The cut on my palm still hurt in the low, persistent way of things that are not healing the way they should. What happened next, I will tell plainly. He had a hunting knife, the kind that comes in a nylon sheath on a belt, practical and undecorated, the tool of someone who spends time outdoors without pretense. He had not, I believe, come to the forest with the intention of using it. I believe the intention formed in the silence that followed the conversation, in the gap between what he had needed to hear and what I had given him, and that it had a kind of logic inside it. The logic of a man who has read the relevant texts and knows that there is one test available, and that applying the test would settle at least one of the questions destroying him. If I was what the book said, if the biology was real, then the knife would prove it and he would know. If I was only an old man with a long memory and an unusual constitution, then the knife would prove that too, and at least something in the night would be resolved. The silence that followed my last sentence was the longest of the night. The moon had moved. The canopy was lighter than it had been an hour ago, the moon high enough to clear the eastern ridge and cast its cold geometry through the branches. I could see Philip's profile, very still, jaw set, the muscles of his face doing the invisible interior work of a man who is trying not to let something show that is showing anyway. He said without looking at me, "Do you believe in God?" I thought about how to answer that. I had been asked that question in more forms than it has formulations, by people ranging from the terrified to the philosophical to the deliberately provocative. I had my own relationship to the question, which was long and complicated, and had gone through more iterations than most religious traditions have sects. "I believe in the wondering," I said finally. "I believe the wondering is the closest thing to sacred that I have encountered, not the answers, the asking." "That's not an answer. It's the most accurate one I have." He was quiet for a long time. The pines moved very slightly in the upper canopy. "I need it to be real," he said, "not to me, more or less to the forest, to the cold air, to whatever was listening that might be more reliable than an old man sitting on the hood of a car. I need it to be, if it isn't, I've built everything." "I know," I said. "You don't know," he said it without heat, just as a fact. "I know what it costs to have a thing that was holding everything up stop holding. I've watched that cost paid by more people than I can count, in every form. I'm not telling you the cost isn't real. I'm telling you it can be survived." "How?" He looked at me then, directly for the first time in a while. His eyes were young in the moonlight. Not naive, he wasn't naive, but young in the way of someone who has not yet had enough time for the deepest losses to accumulate a certain patience. The patience comes eventually if you survive. It is not comfort exactly. It is more like a callous, not numbness, but the thickening that comes from surviving contact. "The same way everything hard is survived," I said, "slowly, one day and then the next, with the help of the people who show up." He looked away again. His jaw was still set. Something had changed in his posture without me being able to locate exactly what, a slight rigidity, a quality of decision that was settling into him the way cold settles into stone, not all at once but irreversibly. "I should have left you alone," he said quietly. "Isabel would have found me regardless. I pushed it. I pushed everyone to keep going when Tara said to stop." "Yes." "And now," he stopped. He moved his right hand slightly, a small gesture not completing itself. I was watching his hands when he moved. He drove the blade into my side below the right rib, not deep. He flinched on the thrust, which most people do. Violence is a thing almost everyone imagines more cleanly than it actually runs. I did not move. I sat still. One hand went to my side. I looked at him. He stepped back. He looked at the knife, at me, at the knife. His face did the thing I had seen faces do at the moment. A large certainty gives way, not the collapse of a building, which is fast and total, but the crack that runs through a foundation, the one you see but cannot immediately account for. He turned. He walked. Then he ran. I heard the brush moving and then his feet on the dirt road and then the sound of a car on pavement diminishing. I sat on the hood of my car with my hand against my side and felt the blood doing what blood does. The wound was not serious in any dimension I could not manage. The pines were still in the upper branches. The moon was high enough now to clear the canopy in the open places and lay white light across the pullout. I put my thumb against the cut on my palm. Both wounds hurt. They hurt in the ordinary way of wounds, which is to say they simply hurt, without the faint underlying sense of rapid repair that I had carried for as long as I could remember. The repair, if it was going to come, was going to take its time. The body was not hurrying the way it used to. I drove 3 towns over to an urgent care clinic. I said I had caught myself on a fence. The physician who sutured my side had steady hands and an incurious face. She said I'd been fortunate. I agreed. She told me to rest and handed me a discharge sheet with instructions I did not need, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of that clinic for a long time, watching the fluorescent light of the entrance play on the wet asphalt. Then I drove to my office. I took a piece of plain paper from the desk drawer and wrote a letter to Harry. Harry had known me across enough of my names in decades that the continuity was real, not the performance of continuity, but the actual thing, the recognition of a person you have known across time so long that the name stops mattering, and what remains is only the quality of attention they bring to being your friend. He was aging in the ordinary human way now, which I thought about as I wrote. He was becoming more obviously mortal in the visible, daily way, and I was becoming, for the first time, slightly less obviously immortal, and there was something in that convergence I could not fully look at but kept looking at anyway. I told him where I was going. I told him the decade was over. I told him about the cut and what it might mean and that I was not frightened. I meant that word specifically. I wrote it carefully and meant it, but that I was thinking seriously about what it means to be at the end of something. Even if the end of something is not an ending. Even if it is only a turning, a new shape for the same duration. I told him I had told a young man the truth on a dark hillside, and the truth had not been what the young man needed, and that I had known it wouldn't be before I said it, and that I had said it anyway, because the alternative was to lie, and I had been lying by omission and elision and careful silence for 14,000 years, and there are moments when even an immortal runs out of patience for the convenient untruth. I said, come find me when you want. I'll be in the wilderness for a while. I need to think. I left a note for Carolyn on the kitchen table. Brief. Honest in the ways I could be honest, and honest too about the limits of what I could say. Not cruel. Not cowardly. The note of a man who is leaving in a way that does not pretend to be something other than leaving, but who also knows that the leaving is not the whole story, that there will be more story after, that the blank space after a note is not the same as an ending. I packed what I had in the car and drove east into the forest. The forest at night in that part of California smells like nothing that exists in translation. Pine and cold and dry earth and the faint mineral quality of granite weathering over geological time. I had walked through forests that are now deserts and deserts that are now forests. I had walked through the older forests of an older world, forests no geologist has named because no geologist was there, forests that preceded every name ever given to anything. I had watched the language develop for naming trees, and then the language develop for the language, and then the systems of record develop for carrying the language forward, each layer accreting over the last. 14,000 years of human beings trying to hold on to what they knew. I found a clearing and made a fire. Not for warmth exactly, for the company of fire, which is a very old company. Some companions you keep not because they are necessary but because they are old, and age alone is a form of kinship. I sat by it and thought about Philip. He had disappeared. Tara had texted me 2 days after the forest, the message brief and careful, Philip is gone. He didn't tell any of us where. I'm sorry. I wrote back, you have nothing to apologize for, take care of yourself. She did not write again. I did not expect her to. I thought about Philip the way I think about most people who have been broken by something I offered, not with guilt, because guilt is only useful when you have made a wrong choice, and I had not made a wrong choice. I had told him the truth. I had told it as carefully as I knew how. I had not told him what he wanted to hear, which was the only other option, and I had tried that option before in other centuries with other people, and had learned that the version where you protect someone from a truth they're asking for is only ever a postponement, not a mercy. Eventually, the truth arrives anyway, and then there is both the truth and the disappointment of having been protected from it. But I thought about him with a weight I couldn't set down, something heavier than sadness and lighter than grief. The weight of knowing that truth is not a cure, that it is sometimes, for some people, the thing that opens the wound rather than closing it. That the most important question, the one that lies under every other question Philip had been asking that night, was not whether I was who he thought I was. It was whether the universe was the size he needed it to be. And I could not answer that. I could not answer it for him, and I could not answer it for myself. My hand was cold against my knee. I moved it to the warmth near the fire and pressed my thumb against the cut. Still there, still slow. The Holocene was the name geologists had given to the epoch I had been born in, the warm, wet, stable 10,000-plus year period after the last glacial maximum, the geological blink of an eye in which human beings had done everything human beings had ever done, built everything, named everything, written everything, believed everything, killed each other over most of it, loved each other in the spaces between, wondered constantly, stubbornly, with an energy completely disproportionate to any survival advantage it provided. Why? Climatologists and Earth system scientists now said the Holocene was over, that a new epoch had begun, the Anthropocene, named for the species that had become large enough to alter the conditions of the world itself. The species I had been walking beside for the entire length of my life had become a geological force. Their fires and their fields and their engines had changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, the temperature of the oceans, the distribution of every living thing on the surface. They had done in 2 centuries what ice ages do in 10,000 years. And they had done it largely by accident, in the course of doing all the other things they were doing, in the course of building and feeding and moving, in the course of the ordinary, astonishing project of keeping themselves alive and wondering why. Whether the change in my healing was connected to the change in the epoch, I did not know. I suspected it was probably not in any direct physical sense. I suspected it was more likely a coincidence, or possibly something internal, something in the particular biological machinery of me that had been running at one rate for 14,000 years and was now, for reasons I could not access, running at a slightly different one. I was not a scientist of myself. I had never found a way to study my own condition with the rigor I might have wished. You can't biopsy your own history. But I had felt it for months before the cut, some slight change in the rhythm of things, some quality in the days that was different from what it had been. Not worse, not frightening, just different. The way a piece of music is different in a different key, the same notes, the same relationships, but the whole of it sitting in a different place in the register, producing a different resonance in the body. I had lasted the Holocene. I wanted to be clear with myself about that, sitting by the fire with my hand near the flame and the pines going dark around me. 14,000 years of it. Every civilization currently on the map and every civilization that isn't. Every plague. Every war that was called a war and every war that was called something else. The long, slow drama of human beings trying to live decently in conditions that made decency genuinely difficult, succeeding often enough to produce what I would call, without sentimentality, a net miracle. I had done it by moving, by staying small, by being one person in a sequence of persons, each persona a complete thing that I inhabited fully and then released, the way a musician plays a song completely and then plays the next one. The key was never reaching for the song after the one you were playing, never gripping. The songs you grip are the songs that tear when you let go, and the tearing leaves you with nothing clean to offer the next one. I had done it by moving, by staying small, by being one person in a sequence of persons, each persona a complete thing that I inhabited fully and then released, the way a musician plays a song completely and then plays the next one. The key was never reaching for the song after the one you were playing, never gripping. The songs you grip are the songs that tear when you let go, and the tearing leaves you with nothing clean to offer the next one. I had been good at it mostly, not always. There had been decades where the leaving had been wrong, too fast, not clean, leaving someone with a version of the truth that was worse than either the full truth or no truth, the partial thing that lets the imagination do its worst work. Those were the decades I thought about in the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, which are the hours that exist, I am convinced, specifically to show you the things you would prefer not to see. I had made mistakes across 14,000 years that I still turned over in the dark hours. I did not make fewer mistakes than other people. I only had more time to accumulate them. What I had learned, accumulated across all of it, was a set of things so basic that most people learn them in a single ordinary human lifetime and simply have fewer opportunities to apply them. Be honest when you can. Stay longer than comfort requires. Leave before you cause damage. Feed people when they are hungry. Do not confuse being seen with being understood. Do not confuse being understood with being loved. All of these are different things, and each requires its own kind of care. The fire was lower now. I fed it one more piece of wood, a knot of pine, dense and resinous, that caught and held. The light steadied. Carolyn would find the note. She would be hurt, and then she would be practical, because she was a person of great practicality, and after the hurt she would assemble the available information into the most rational interpretation of it and proceed. She was good at proceeding. It was one of the things I had loved about her most, and love is not entirely stopped by absence. It continues in a different form, the way a fire that has gone out leaves warmth in the stones around it. I hoped the warmth would last her. I hoped, sitting by my fire in the California dark, that the decade we had given each other would sustain her in the way that real things sustain, not by being permanent, but by having been real. Harry would come. I knew he would come because he always had. The letter would arrive and he would read it and he would make the drive and he would find me, because that was the quality of him that had persisted across every decade I had known him. He showed up. That was all. That was everything. In 14,000 years of watching human beings do every possible thing to and for and against each other, I had come to the conclusion that showing up is the most underestimated form of love, the quietest form, the most durable. Everything else, the grand gestures, the monuments, the declarations, is subject to revision. Showing up is not. You either came or you didn't. Harry would come. I put more wood on the fire. The pines around the clearing were very still. Somewhere in the upper canopy, a bird said something once, briefly, and was answered by nothing and went quiet. I pressed my thumb against the cut on my palm. Still there. The sutures in my side were tight and warm. 2 wounds, both slow. The body doing what it was doing at whatever pace it had decided to do it. I had been a caveman, not in the sense of the caricature, the club, the grunting, the dragging. In the actual sense, a man who lived in close contact with the land, who knew the land the way you know a language you have spoken since before you can remember knowing it. I had been a farmer in the valley of a river whose name has changed 4 times since I farmed there. I had been a soldier in armies whose flags are held now in museums, armies that believed, as all armies believe, that their particular conflict was the one that would resolve things. I had been a physician, a trader, a builder of things that fell down and were built again by other hands, a teacher in every form that teaching has taken, from the hillside with the crowd to the seminar room with 16 students and a whiteboard. And now I was a man sitting by a fire in a California forest, thinking about what comes next. What comes next, I decided, was nothing dramatic. No revelation, no announcement, no emergence into the public world, no press conference, no book of my own to answer Art Jenkins' book. Those options had been available to me before in other centuries, and I had never taken them, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that the human tendency to make a landmark of a person, to turn a truth-teller into an institution, a teacher into a god, an old man into a proof of something, was exactly what I wanted no part of. I had made that mistake before. The making of it had followed me for 2,000 years. No, what comes next is the same thing that came before in a different key, a new place, a new name. A new decade of teaching and quiet, and the small ordinary transactions of a life that is real, even if it is partial, even if the depth of it is not something I can share. Harry would find me and we would sit by this fire or another fire, and he would tell me about his life, and I would tell him what I could and it would be enough, in the way that enough always is, not complete, not perfect, but sufficient. The kindness that is possible inside the limits of what people can say to each other. I pulled my coat tighter. The fire was lower. The stars were the same stars they had always been, cold and indifferent and very far away, burning in a darkness that preceded everything I had ever known or done or said, burning long before there was a word for burning. I put my hand flat against the earth. The earth was cold and solid, and had been solid for the entire length of me. 14,000 years of weight on it, my footprints overlapping my footprints, the path I had walked curling back across itself more times than I could map. It was still there. So was I.